My grandpa always taught me to fear rainy days. He would tell me these stories about Redvark, the local maximum security prison. He would tell me about the violent criminals and the deeds they did to end up there. He would explain to me how some of these men were so dangerous that they couldn't be trusted to live in normal jail cells, that they needed to be chained to the stone walls. My grandpa would tell me about rainy days and stormy nights, how the rain would weaken the stone, and how these men could pull the chains right out of the wall if the weather was bad enough. He showed me newspaper clippings of escapees. There was always a handful per year. He would tell me that, to a T, the prison breaks always coincided with rainy weather. Most escapees would flee to the surrounding neighbourhoods. They would try to hide in people's garages and basements, under their porches, waiting for the rain to pass. Sometimes the men would break into the houses. Sometimes the men would do unspeakable things to people residing in those houses. We lived only about 8 miles from Redvark, and on rainy days, my grandpa would remind me of this. My grandpa would tell me that on rainy days it was best just to stay in my room, to lock my door, to put some music on low, grab a comic book, and get my head somewhere else. He even taught me how to turn my closet into a fortress of solitude. We threw a blanket and couple of pillows in there. I had a few posters of superheroes on the closet wall. I kept a box of comic books and baseball cards in one corner, and a metallic footlocker filled with junk food and cassette tapes in the other. My grandpa would encourage me to get in the closet when it rained, especially when it stormed. I would sit in there listening to my Walkman. I would finger through comic books. I would bundle myself up against the pillows and drift to sleep. I felt safe in my closet, and I enjoyed the hours that I would spend in there on rainy days. He would tell me that most of the time during escapes, the convicts would usually only hurt people they happened to come across. If they broke into a home to avoid police, and there was a family sitting around the TV in the living room, they would strike. He would tell me that if a Redvark prisoner escaped, and if they came to our neighbourhood, and if they broke into our house, that as long as I stayed in my closet, I'd be okay. It would be possible for a convict to find me and hurt me, but as long as I stayed in my closet fort, I would be as safe as anyone in town. I would remind myself of this on rainy days. I would sit in my closet and think about it, and it would make me feel safe. My grandpa disappeared one June. I lived with him alone. My parents had died years earlier. My grandpa disappeared, and I was afraid to call the police. I knew if something happened to my grandpa, the police would take me away and force me to live in a home. I didn't want to live in a home. I had a home. I kept his disappearance to myself for over a week. I would walk myself to school. I knew where Grandpa kept emergency cash, and so I would take a little here and there to the corner bodega and buy some milk and sandwich meats. One day, about 8 days after his disappearance, they let us out of school early. Storm of the century, they said. Thunder and lightning. Heavy rain all night. The rain was so heavy that night, the local streets flooded over. On the walk home from school, the water was up to my ankles. By 9 o'clock, the water was coming up to people's knees. I got home, climbed into my little hiding space, and covered myself in a blanket. Thunder clapped outside. I was very afraid. The storm itself unsettled me, but thinking about Redbark, and how easy it would be to escape during a storm like this, terrified me. We lost power after a little while. I sat in the closet in darkness. I turned to my Walkman for solace. After a few hours, the music started to stutter. After a few more minutes, it stopped altogether. Batteries, dead as doornails. I continued to sit in silence. The power hadn't come back on yet. The darkness and silence enveloped me. Then the silence was broken by a scratching noise some distance away. I ignored it at first, but it grew louder and more insistent. Finally, I reluctantly left the safety of my fort. In the upstairs hallway, I stopped and listened. The noise was clearly coming from downstairs. I descended the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I got to the kitchen and stopped to listen again. The noise still sounded as if it were coming from below me. We had no basement, so the fact that the noises were coming from beneath me was unsettling. There were more noises now too, not just the scraping. I thought I heard moaning. I crouched low to the floor, listening. The noises got louder as I entered the living room. Louder still as I entered the main corridor. I stopped on the throw rug at the end of the hallway. The noises were at their loudest here below me. I pulled the throw rug away and saw a trapdoor. It must have led to a basement or crawl space. I had no idea it existed. I had no idea there was anything under that rug. I wondered why it was padlocked. I grabbed a ring of old keys that hung on the hook in the mud room. I tried the keys in the padlock one after another. The fourth key slid into the lock, like a base runner sliding into... Something pounded against the bottom of the trapdoor. It was followed by muffled voices. "Hello, Ebby there?" I could barely make out the voices. "Help us!" I understood that. I turned the key and lifted up the trapdoor. The worst smell I've ever known wafted up and hit me in the chest. I instantly heard women crying, and a man's voice sobbing. "Thank God! Oh, thank God!" And then another. "Water! Please! We need water!" The next few days were a whirlwind. Police, media, and gawkers descended on the house. Our small town in Arizona never saw much excitement. The news of a homegrown serial killer sent an electric jolt through the populace. The media was relentless. The police had a million questions. "Where is your grandfather?" "I don't know." "Did you know what he was doing? Did you help him hide his secret?" "No," I said. "No, never." "Did you help your grandfather bury the bodies in the backyard?" "No." "You must have helped," they said. "No." "You must have helped. An old man like that wouldn't be able to dig in the Arizona clay all by himself." And then it hit me. "Rain," I said. The policeman looked at me blankly. "What?" He'd wait for the rain.
I've never told this story to anyone, and I don't really intend to tell it again. I have a pounding migraine today, and this thread has kept me good company as I've drifted in and out. I don't really like talking about this time in my life, but I want to contribute. When I was 10 or 12, I lived with my mother. We were below poverty level poor. We lived up in the mountains around Santa Cruz, California. My mother had a friend that owned a large bit of property up there, and he let us stay in a trailer up there. Our trailer was very small, and was right beside a garden. A chain-link fence ran around the garden to keep the dog the owner had out, along with other animals. Deer and things are very common in the area. Also, inside the fenced area was a single room. It was built like a tiny house, but it was only a single room on the inside. This room had electricity, and since our actual trailer didn't, I spent a lot of time in there. I was super into video games. There is one thing you should know right now. This small fenced-in area was only a small part of the property, but most of it was heavily forested. Also, I refused to leave the fenced area because the owner's dog had been mistreated by children in the past, and was very sketchy towards me all the time. If I was alone, it would bite at me, even through the fence. The fence was tall, at least 7 feet high, and wasn't movable. So as long as the gate was closed, I was safe. There is no one else around for miles and miles. Now, I tell you all this because I think it is important you understand what kind of scene this was before I really get into this story. We have a fenced-in location that seems fairly safe. It contains a trailer and a single room with power that is not connected to the trailer. Nothing else around for miles. My mum's van is parked out in front of the gate to the fenced-in area, and a single unpaved road runs from this garden for about a mile to the main house. I brought friends up there to sleep over here and there. We all thought it was pretty cool, you know, like camping out, sort of. Besides, we would get our own room to stay in, to play video games all night long. It was like a dream come true. The downside was simple. When it got dark out, it got really, really dark out. No city around, and the trailer would not be lit up. There was no bathroom to use in the room, and you would have to walk through the dark garden in order to get to the trailer to use it. Odd things happened out here from time to time. It was always something that could be somewhat easily explained away though. Noises like people working at night sometimes. Or once me and a friend were sitting out in the garden and we saw a shadow as big as a small bear bound up a tree, but the tree didn't shake like there was any weight on it. The dog also creeped me out, but you know, angry dog. I was a kid. It happens. Now, I'm a scaredy cat. I always have been. To be honest, I don't know why I even came to X. I have trouble walking through a lit house if I'm all alone. My friends, however, tend to be more outgoing. Just the kinds of people I get along with. This time I had a friend over. His name was Jacob. We were staying up all night and playing Sonic the Hedgehog 3 on my Sega Genesis on a ratty old television. We started playing as the sun went down, and by the time we were finishing up the game, it was about 2 AM. That's when we heard it. We turned off the game, getting ready to find something else to play. There was a rumbling in the woods behind the room we were in, like somebody was rolling something really heavy around. We hadn't heard it before, because the noise from what we were playing was loud. Immediately I had goosebumps. Jacob wasn't really worried about it, but it's not like there was someone else's house or yard right over there. It was forest for miles, and it sounded like someone was constructing something or some shit, dragging or rolling something really big. Eventually, Jacob convinced me to just play some more games. I agreed on the condition that we turned the volume down so we could hear if something happened. We started playing, and I didn't even notice the noise stop because I was getting too engrossed. A couple of hours later, Jacob said he had to use the bathroom. I was feeling fine by then, so I was fine when he left the trailer to relieve himself. He was taking a while, so eventually I decided I was going to go check on him. Besides, I could use the bathroom and grab a snack while I was at it. I opened the door to leave, and he was just standing in the doorway, right outside the door, facing it. He scared the shit out of me. I asked him what he was doing, and he just stood there, blocking the exit. I realized he must have sneaked up to the door, because I could hear him walk away from the room, but I hadn't heard him walk back up to it. It was super quiet out there, without the noises of the city. I should have been able to hear. He refused to say anything or respond. He just stood there. I told him he was really creeping me out, but it was not unlike him to try and scare me like this. Finally, I decided to just go to the trailer and use the bathroom myself. Partially because I knew my mother was asleep in there. I told him what I was doing, then moved past him. When I pushed him out of the way a little, his skin felt freezing to the touch. I jumped a little, but it was a cold night, and he had been standing out there for like 30 minutes, so I figured this was to be expected. I walked as quickly as I could over to the trailer. He followed me, like right on my tail. It was unnerving. I joked a little, saying that he already surprised me by scaring me at the door. The joke is already over. Finally I got to the trailer and walked in. He didn't follow, just stayed at the doorway. I checked on my mum, who was fast asleep, then turned to go into the bathroom. Now, it being a porta potty, we keep the bathroom door shut, because it, well, smells bad. When I reached for the door and tried to open it though, it's locked. A nervous voice came from behind the door. I'm in here." I quickly turned to look at Jacob, but the door was still open, and there was nothing there but pitch black night. I freeze in terror. I would have heard the bathroom door open if he had come in behind me and gone that way. There is no way to do it quietly. It creaks like a motherfucker. I yelped so loud that my mum woke up, startled. I stared at the doorway, unable to bring myself to move a muscle. She got up, walked over there and looked out. Not seeing anything, she closed the door and asked me what was wrong. By now, Jacob was coming out of the bathroom and acting perfectly normal, but a bit confused. I explained what had happened. Jacob said he was just taking a long time in the bathroom, basically. Neither of them believed me at all, no matter how much I insisted. My mum is sure that I just got sleepy and imagined it. Jacob thought I was trying to prank him. So, my mum gets out a big flashlight and walks us back to the room. She tells us to go back to sleep, then leaves and goes back to bed herself. Now, this room doesn't have any windows or anything, so after a while I calm back down a little. I'm telling myself that my mum was right. I must have had like a waking dream or something. Jacob insists that he was in the bathroom the whole time, and I'm inclined to believe him, because there is just no way to really get round without being heard. So I settle down. I'm a little rattled, but I'm thinking I can just sleep it off through the night. Suddenly, the dog starts going nuts, right behind us. The room is up against the fence, so the dog must have been like right behind the room on the other side. I felt like I jumped so high I was surprised I didn't hit the roof. Jacob's laughing at me like, "Ha! Dog barking at a squirrel or some shit, and you are shitting yourself." It keeps going for that like a long time though. Suddenly the barking stops and gets replaced by whimpering. We hear the dog run away. There are about 45 seconds of silence before we hear something new. A small scratching sound on the back of the wall of the room. We both try to be as silent as we can. Eventually, it stops. After 5 or so minutes of silence, Jacob decides to be brave. He insists he is going to get my mother up, to tell her something crazy is going on, and we're going to go from there. With some kind of divine adult protection, no doubt. I wish he wouldn't leave me alone, but there is no way I am going out there. Never ever. He arms himself as best he can, with a tennis racket we had in the room with us. Then he takes a couple of deep breaths, opens the door, and dashes out. I close it as quick as I can behind him. In less than 30 seconds, I hear a scream. Not long after that, the door flies open, and he comes back in looking pale as a ghost. He's breathing like he just ran a marathon. His eyes look as big as dinner plates. I ask what is going on like 4 times before he finally starts getting words out. He tells me he walked out there, and as he was walking through the garden as quick as he could, he saw my mum, just standing there. He tried to talk to her, but she stared at him with a blank expression. Getting super creeped out because of what happened to me earlier, he took a couple more steps toward her, telling her that he thought something was in the woods. Suddenly, her face turned to an awkward smile. Then he realized something terrible. He hadn't noticed sooner, because of the darkness, and how much of a hurry he had been in. She was on the other side of the fence. Now, the door to this room does not lock. And as I explained earlier, this room had no windows. He had been trying to move stuff in front of the door as he told this story, and by the end I was helping him. In retrospect, whatever was harassing us seemed to be averse to actually entering the room or the trailer, because the Jacob one didn't come in either time he could have, and this room was not sturdy. Either way, we stacked everything we could against the door, thinking somehow that like cartoons, this would totally definitely keep the creature out. For the rest of the night, we heard scratches coming from all around the room. I cried. Jacob looked like his mind had left his body with fear. At one time, I thought I heard it speak too. I heard from right next to where I was resting against the wall, in my mother's voice quietly. The same exact phrasing and intonation she had used earlier in the night. "What's wrong?" followed immediately by, "Go to sleep." The sun must have come up eventually. The scratching eventually stopped. We heard my mum come to get us, this time actually hearing footsteps. We absolutely refused to leave the room. My mum had to go to get the property owner and have him take the door off. When we saw that it was actually her, I burst into tears again. We never had any experiences like this again, and eventually moved away. But that night still haunts me. I still refuse to go out at night unless I am with a bunch of people, and I will never ever live in the woods again. I'm writing this because my family won't talk about it anymore. I'm the only one who can't seem to forget. I was raised on the outskirts of Preston, a small town in southern Idaho with a population of about 5,000 people. My more immediate community was an isolated, dead-end dirt road called Bear Creek. Less than 20 families lived on the Bear Creek. I didn't mind being so isolated. I grew up in the comfort of wide fields and close neighbours that only rural people know. We were a Mormon community, very church-centred, very community-centred. All the young girls, myself included, were part of the young women's group, and all the boys were members of the local Boy Scout troop, which doubled as a church group in our area. We had 4th of July parties at the local ballpark and swam in the nearby reservoir. It was a good, quiet community. My house, a 92-year-old farmhouse built by my great-great-grandfather, was situated on a small hill, surrounded by a wide grass field on one side and a snaking dirt road on the other. Across the road was the creek bottoms. Southern Idaho is categorized in a desert climate, so not much grows outside of the irrigated fields, besides sagebush and burrs. The creek bottoms were the exception. The creek fed the growth of a thick tangle of pussy willow bushes. In the late fall we used to go down into the bottoms and pick the white, cottony pussy willow seeds to decorate the fences of our driveway. Being so isolated, it wasn't uncommon for animals to come down from the mountains. We had a female moose who brought her calf down and lived in our orchard every winter, and the occasional lion wasn't unheard of either. The summer when I turned 8, I remember because it was the same year as my baptism. A smaller mountain lion was spotted several times in our area. We weren't worried. The big cats stayed away from the farms and usually moved on when the area didn't yield enough food. The same summer, my neighbour, Peyton, was working on his Eagle Scout project. He loved National Geographic and thought it would be pretty cool to try putting together a National Geographic submission on our little creek bottoms. The young lion that happened to be in our area at the same time made him especially excited. He decided he wanted to try and get pictures of the lion and emailed the National Geographic team for advice. They recommended setting up an automatic camera that takes shots every couple of seconds in an area the lion was known to visit. They also recommended setting some kind of bait, so the lion was more likely to come by. No one in the creek liked the idea of live bait or carrion, so we came up with a different kind of bait. We decided to set up an audio recording of a dying rabbit and play it on a loop through a set of speakers hidden in the willows. I remember when everyone was down in the bottoms testing the speakers, and I heard the noise for the first time. The sound of a dying rabbit is horrible. It's been described as being almost identical to the sound of a screaming child. If you've never heard it yourself, there's plenty of recordings available online. It's worth a listen. The camera was set up. The speakers were set up. Everything was perfect. Peyton explained that he would allow the camera and recording to play uninterrupted for a week, and then he would go check on it. This would give him time for our scent to fade away from the bottoms, and encourage the lion to come closer. At first I was worried about the noise. It was a truly horrible noise, and our house was the closest to the setup point in the bottoms. My father assured me that the noise wouldn't reach as far as our house, and I was relieved when we arrived home that night that he was correct. The bottoms were far enough away that I couldn't hear anything. I remember Peyton the next day at church. He was fidgety and excited to check on the equipment, but he had to wait a week, which everybody kept reminding him. He couldn't risk going down too early and scaring the lion away for good. That night, I woke up to an awful noise. I sat ramrod straight in my bed, with my eyes wide in the dark. Hands clutched so hard to my palms that they bore the indent of my fingernails for hours after. I knew that noise. It was the recording of the rabbit. It sounded faint and far off, like it really could have been coming from the bottoms. But that was impossible, because the recording had been going all night the previous day, and I hadn't heard a thing. I didn't sleep that night. I was too scared to get out of bed and wake my parents. The recording played over and over again. I had the loop memorized. In the morning I stumbled into the kitchen for breakfast. My mum and dad were sitting at the kitchen table. They too had dark rings under their eyes. I hadn't been the only one who'd heard it. Mum was convinced that the equipment must have been broken. She wanted to go down into the bottoms and check it out. Dad refused. He was a kind, gentle man, and didn't want to stir up any unnecessary drama. He was sure there had been a strong wind last night, and the wind was carrying the noise farther than its natural reach. He told us to listen. We did. He was right, and we couldn't hear it now. We forgot about it, and went about our daily goings. The next night, it happened again. I stayed up in bed with my back to the wall. The screaming was even louder than before, but this time, something was different. It was lower pitched than I remember, and parts of the loop were slowed down, as if the recording were warped in places. At times the loop did not loop naturally, and instead picked up at a random place in the middle. My mum didn't mention anything at the breakfast table, but both her and my dad seemed tense. The third night, I mustered the courage to stand beside my bedroom window and look out into the yard. For a moment I stood, rooted to the spot, my hands shaking, no matter how hard I clenched them. The noise sidled in through the cracks in the window. I watched the outline of the trees in the yard, perfectly still. Not even the slightest breeze stirred their branches. My mum announced that she would be going to visit her sisters in town the next day, and would probably spend the night there. She invited me to come along, but I was a daddy's girl at heart and chose to stay at the farm. I took Mum's place beside Dad in their bed that night, but even that didn't help. I don't think my dad was asleep either, for he was unnaturally still the whole night. We began to hear the noise during the day too. I was drawing with chalk on the sidewalk when it happened. My shoulders tensed, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. There was only one scream, a short, high-pitched one, and then the recording fell silent. It happened again several times throughout the day, but never the whole loop, just clips from it. Later that evening, Peyton's dad came up the driveway on his four-wheeler. He said he was looking for their dog, a sweet yellow lab who had been missing since that morning. Dad said he was sorry and that we hadn't seen her. I stared at him, silently begging him to mention the recording, but he didn't. He was a quiet man after all. He didn't want to bring up any unnecessary drama. Mum stayed away the whole week. Dad and I didn't sleep. By Saturday, the screaming could be heard constantly, though it seemed to have deviated from the familiar loop entirely. I didn't recognize any of it. Sometimes the screams were thin and long, other times there were hardly more than growls. Once, while my dad had been heating up meatloaf for lunch, the noise rose into such a rancorous din that he dropped the plate and it shattered. I pressed my hands over my ears, where I sat at the table, and squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't help. The noise forced its way in through the cracks in my fingers, and pinched my throat and rattled in my rib cage. The din lasted for a whole minute, then fell silent. Dad was shaking. That was the last we heard of the noise that day. Peyton came by Saturday evening to ask permission to cross our road to collect the equipment. He was so excited. I watched him disappear into the creek bottoms with a sense of tired relief. After the equipment was gone, it would all stop. I couldn't wait to get a full night's sleep. Not a minute later I spotted Peyton coming back up from the creek. I was confused. It had taken us much longer to set up the camera and speakers, so I'd only assumed it would take him just as long to collect them. My breath stilled when Peyton came closer. He didn't look right. His eyes were wide and his face was pale. Something wet dribbled from his chin and onto his shirt. I later realized it was vomit. My dad caught him before he fell and demanded to know what had happened. But Peyton couldn't speak. He just cried. We called his dad. I looked after Peyton as both my dad and his dad went into the bottoms. They were gone a long time. When they returned, their faces were grim, and they smelled funny. I noticed red on my dad's hands. I asked what was wrong, but they brushed right past me and immediately called the police. Nobody would tell me what had happened. I sat on the couch as a blur of neighbours and police officers swirled around me. At one point, an officer placed something on the kitchen table and left. I looked into the kitchen curiously. It was the camera from the bottoms. I wish I hadn't looked. The camera was a little banged up. Tiny scratches and dents covered the plastic casing. When I lifted it, my hand stuck to the plastic. Something tacky and odorous covered the screen, but it turned on fine. The first set of photos were normal. just the pussy willows cast green in the glow of the night setting. As I continued to click through them, they quickly became strange. At one point the camera angle changed, as if the camera had been knocked from its post. Grass now obscured most of the frame. Flecks of red appeared on the lens, and remained for the rest of the sets. One photo made me pause. There was a figure in this one, or half of a figure, as most of the upper torso hadn't made it into the frame. I thought it could be human, but it didn't look like it should be standing upright. Its legs were twisted, like an animal, and it seemed to be having difficulty supporting itself in an upright position. Beside the legs, a long, thin arm hung. Whatever it must have been stooped over, for its fingertips hung below its crooked knees. The next set was different. It was as if the camera had been picked up and was now being held. The first photo was of the bottoms at night. The next startled me. I had to look closely before deciding what it was. A rabbit had been laid in the bushes, but its ears and most of its scalp had been peeled away. The next was of the same rabbit, but a thin, dark hand was holding it up against the sky. Its limp body hung like something from a nightmare. In the following photos, more rabbits joined the one, each with their ears and scalp removed. Then a cat. Then more cats. Then a dog, the yellow lab. Then the lion. The following photo was of 7 rabbits, 3 cats, 1 dog and the lion, all laid out in a row facing the same way. Their arms and legs had been arranged as if they were marching, like some parade. All of their scalps had been removed, and tiny white glints of their skulls could be seen. The last photo was overly bright, like the photo had been taken too close with the flash on. An eye dominated the frame, but it was yellowed and crusty, and had a bar pupil like a horse. In the bottom corner, the edge of a mouth could be seen. No lips, just teeth, sharp and little, with wide gaps of red gum between them. I wish I hadn't looked. I heard my dad talking to the police outside. They said the speakers had malfunctioned. The recording had only played the first night. I live in Oak Park, just outside of Chicago, Illinois. See, we have an ordinance here where you're not allowed to put up a for sale sign in front of your house. So many homes are vacant here that they'd be absolutely everywhere if we could put them up. So in order to ensure people want to live here, we make it so it doesn't look like nobody wants to live here. Thus, no for sale signs. I live alone with my pet cat, an all-black cat which I found out recently is a rarity. His name is Calvin. He was the runt of the litter. This isn't really important. The story all started about 2 months ago. That's when I first got up late at night after a bad dream and went out for a cigarette and saw my neighbour from directly across the street was sitting in front of his large, bright television, which was facing right out his window at my house. I didn't think anything of it. As days went on, I kept looking out my window and seeing my neighbour just sitting there, watching TV. After 2 weeks, I came to the conclusion that he could very well be dead. It just didn't make sense that he was just sitting there, TV on, not leaving the couch for weeks. I could only see the back of his head, and he very well may have moved while I was at work. But knowing it was there, the light of his television kept me up at night, and for hours on end, there would just be no movement. I came to the conclusion that I should call the police to ask if they could check up on my neighbour. I didn't know him very well, we met twice. He was an older guy. I used to see him shoveling snow or raking leaves, and I'd offer to help, and he said no both times. He was a fairly active guy for his age, and it didn't add up that he'd just sit there for days, watching TV and not leaving his house. So I called the police and told them, and they offered to check it out. I saw them pull up and couldn't help but watch. I was very curious, and even though I thought all that would happen was they call up an ambulance or something and remove my neighbour's dead body, not something I'd usually be extremely interested in watching, I had grown so curious about what was going on over there that I couldn't settle for the simple answer that my neighbour simply died in front of his television. After knocking a few times, I saw them open up the front door and walk in. They looked around. One of them left the living room, so I couldn't see where he'd gone. I could only see the one room where my neighbour's windows were. The one officer turned off the television and also left my sight. They both left and drove off. About 20 minutes later, I got a call explaining that the house was empty and my neighbour had moved out. They said a real estate agent had probably just accidentally left the television on. I went into a few real estate websites and, as it were, the house was indeed for sale. Anticlimactic, but at least it was a far less morbid conclusion than I'd expected. I was sort of embarrassed that my mind had immediately gone to death when it really was so bland and simple, and I felt like a pretty bad person for actually feeling a slight sense of disappointment when I found out my neighbour hadn't died as I'd assumed. I had no way of knowing without the real estate signs up front, and I had no reason to question it. My neighbour had moved out, plain and simple. When I went to bed that night, it had pretty much left my head entirely. My bedroom window faces out towards my neighbour's house. For the last 2 weeks I had been watching the television from my bed. It was how I went to sleep, just confusedly staring in wonder, slightly disturbed, knowing I could be looking at the back of the head of my dead neighbour. And since I had been staring at that television for the last 2 weeks, it took me a few minutes to register the horror when I crawled into bed and looked at the television, which was still on across the street. I didn't sleep very well. Every night, for about a month and a half, I'd just see that television. During the day it was on. I'd walk up to the house when I was feeling more adventurous and knock on the door, but nobody answered. I started smoking quite a bit in lieu of proper sleep. Every night, I'd walk by the house, curious, scared, and confused. I contacted the estate agent and asked if they were giving tours, and she said that they were not, so it didn't get turned on during some open house. I thought maybe I was hallucinating, that the television was never on, but the officer definitely went over and turned it off, so it had been absolutely switched on, at least in the first place. I invited a friend over 2 weeks ago, and after a little hanging out, I told him the story and asked, straight-faced and horrified, if the television was on. He said that it was. He was clearly concerned for my health, and I don't blame him. So, the only other option I could think of was that maybe a squatter had taken up residence in the vacant house. It wasn't common in the area, as far as I knew. There's very little crime or homelessness in the suburban area I live in, so it didn't really make any sense for somebody to squat there, but it was all I could think of. Last night I worked up the courage to confront this squatter. I was going to call the police, but assuming the squatter had been there when I first called, I doubted it would do anything to tell them again. I worked it out in my head, but as long as somebody else was living in that house illegally, it wasn't so bad for me to walk over and enter uninvited myself. Stupidly, I worked up this courage while smoking a cigarette late at night, where the only light out was the light pollution over to the east in Chicago and the dim light of the street lamps. Shaking, both from the terrible cold weather we've been having lately and from the nervousness taking over, I opened the door. I was hoping the door was locked, so I could back down on my sudden wave of courage and walk away without feeling like I was just running off with my tail between my legs. To my surprise and dismay, the door was not locked. I felt briefly confused, wondering why the estate agent hadn't put in a lock like they did when they sold my house. But I realised that if there was somebody squatting here, then it shouldn't come as a surprise that there wasn't exactly airtight security. Slowly, timidly, I walked towards the living room. I could hear the faint murmur of infomercials, and see the moving lights and colours of the screen shine as I tiptoed, trying to make as little noise as possible. My whole body went cold as I entered the room. There was my squatter, a middle-aged woman, wrinkly, grey-haired, dressed like a homeless person. It at least added up. I was more horrified at the fact that I had to now confront them than at the woman herself. I stuttered a scared hello, and she looked at me, and before I could form a thought, she screamed the most hellish, horrifying scream I've ever heard. It was not the scream of a middle-aged woman. It was demonic, deep, and ear-splitting. I froze up, and my heart sank, and my eyes widened, and I stared, accepting that I was going to die, at this screaming woman for what seemed like eternity. It was an unwavering scream. It didn't sound like she was losing her breath after what had to have been a whole minute. The moment the initial wave of shock wore off, I just turned and ran. She hadn't moved, save for turning to look at me as she screamed, and I looked to make sure she hadn't gotten up to follow me out, and she had not. I ran to my house. I considered calling the police, but I didn't want to explain the situation or risk getting myself into legal trouble for trespassing on my neighbour's property. And if they went there, and again did not find the squatter, there was no question that I'd be seen as completely insane. I lay awake, refusing to look across the street at the television screen, and my thoughts raced. Surely it had to have just been a squatter. She looked like one. She was clearly living in a house that wasn't hers. She was probably a mentally unstable homeless woman. I decided the scream couldn't have been as awful as I had thought. It was all just the makings of a scared mind. I actually managed to get some sleep, shockingly enough, and when I woke up, I briefly didn't even remember what had happened the night before. What I woke up to was somewhat odd. My cat always sleeps downstairs, in the living room on the sofa, but I found him, wide awake, sitting on my bed cleaning himself. In all my years living here, I never woke up with him in my room. I pet him for a little and went downstairs. As I began remembering the events of the previous night, I decided to go out for a cigarette, and on my way out, I found that my front door had been unlocked. I ran through last night in my head, and I remembered vividly my frantic run home, ending in me making sure all my doors were locked. My memory is very rarely faulty. I felt my stomach churn, and my heart sink, and I felt a chill as I walked back upstairs to go to my living room. What I found would have been entirely mundane in any other setting. My television set was on. I called the police to explain the situation. I called out of work, and I'm spending the next few days in my friend's home with my laptop and my cat. Have you ever forgotten your phone? When did you realize you'd forgotten it? I'm guessing you didn't just smack your forehead and say "damn" for no reason. The realization probably didn't dawn on you spontaneously. More likely, you reached for your phone, pouring open your pocket or handbag, and were momentarily confused by it not being there. Then you did a mental re-step of the morning's events. Shit. In my case, my phone's alarm woke me up as normal, but I realised the battery was lower than I expected. It was a new phone, and it had this annoying habit of leaving applications running that drained the battery overnight. So I put it onto charge while I showered, instead of into my bag like normal. It was a momentary slip from the routine, but that was all it took. Once in the shower, my brain got back into the routine it follows every morning, and that was it. Forgotten. This wasn't just me being clumsy, as I later researched. This is a recognised brain function. Your brain doesn't just work on one level, it works on many. Like, when you're walking somewhere, you think about your destination and avoiding hazards, but you don't need to think about keeping your legs moving properly. I wasn't thinking about regulating my breathing. I was thinking whether or not I should grab a coffee on the drive to work. I did. I wasn't thinking about moving my breakfast through my intestines. I was wondering whether I'd finish on time to pick up my daughter Emory from daycare after work, or get stuck with another late fee. This is the thing. There's a level of your brain that just deals with routine, so that the rest of the brain can just think about other things. Think about it. Think about your last commute. What do you actually remember? Little, if anything, probably. Most common journeys blur into one, and recalling any one in particular is scientifically proven to be difficult. Do something often enough, and it becomes routine. Keep doing it, and it stops being processed by the thinking bit of the brain, and gets relegated to a part of the brain dedicated to dealing with routine. Your brain keeps doing it without you thinking about it. Soon, you think about your route to work as much as you do keeping your legs moving when you walk. As in, not at all. Most people call it autopilot, but there's danger there. If you have to break your routine, your ability to remember and account for the break is only as good as your ability to stop your brain going into routine mode. My ability to remember my phone being on the counter is only as reliable as my ability to stop my brain entering the morning routine mode, which would dictate that my phone is actually in my bag. But I didn't stop my brain entering routine mode. I got in the shower as normal. Routine started. Exception forgotten. Autopilot engaged. My brain was back in the routine. I showered. I shaved. The radio forecast amazing weather. I gave Emily her breakfast and loaded her into the car. She was so adorable that morning. She complained about the bad sun in the morning blinding her, saying it stopped her having a little sleep on the way to daycare, and left. That was the routine. It didn't matter that my phone was on the counter, charging silently. My brain was in the routine, and in the routine, my phone was in my bag. This is why I forgot my phone. Not clumsiness, not negligence, nothing more than my brain entering routine mode and overwriting the exception. Autopilot engaged. I left for work. It's a swelteringly hot day already. The bad sun had been burning since before my traitorously absent phone woke me. The steering wheel was burning hot to the touch when I sat down. I think I heard Emily shift over behind my driver's seat to get out of the glare. But I got to work, submitted the report, attended the morning meeting. It's not until I took a quick coffee break and reached for my phone that the illusion shattered. I did a mental re-step. I remembered the dying battery. I remembered putting it onto charge. I remembered leaving it there. My phone was on the counter. Autopilot disengaged. Again, therein lies the danger. Until you have that moment, the moment you reach for your phone and shatter the illusion, that part of the brain is still in routine mode. It has no reason to question the facts of the routine. That's why it's a routine. It's not as if anyone could say, "Why didn't you remember your phone? Didn't it occur to you? How could you forget? You must be negligent." This is to miss the point. My brain was telling me the routine was completed as normal, despite the fact that it wasn't. It wasn't that I forgot my phone. According to my brain, according to the routine, my phone was in my bag. Why would I think to question it? Why would I check? Why would I suddenly remember, out of nowhere, that my phone was on the counter? My brain was wired into the routine, and the routine was that my phone was in my bag. The day continued to bake. The morning haze gave way to the relentless fever heat of the afternoon. Tarmac bubbled. The direct beams of heat threatened to crack the pavement. People swapped coffees for iced smoothies. Jackets discarded, sleeves rolled up, ties loosened, brows mopped. The park slowly filled with sunbathers and barbecues. Window frames threatened to warp. The thermometer continued to swell. Thank fuck the offices were air-conditioned. But, as ever, the furnace of the day gave way to a cooler evening. Another day, another dollar. Still cursing myself for forgetting my phone, I drove home. The day's heat had baked the inside of the car, releasing a horrible smell from somewhere. When I arrived on the driveway, the stones crunching comfortingly under my tyres, my wife greeted me at the door. "Where's Emily?" she said. Fuck! As if the phone wasn't bad enough. After everything, I'd left Emily at fucking daycare after all. I immediately sped back to the daycare centre. I got to the door and started practicing my excuses, wondering vainly if I could charm my way out of a late fee. I saw a piece of paper stuck to the door. Due to vandalism overnight, please use side door. Today only. Overnight? What? The door was fine this morning. I froze. My knees shook. Vandals. A change in the routine. My phone was on the counter. I hadn't been here this morning. My phone was on the counter. I'd driven past because I was drinking my coffee. I'd not dropped off Emily. My phone was on the counter. She'd fallen asleep out of the bad sun. She didn't speak when I drove past her nursery. My phone was on the counter. She'd changed the routine. My phone was on the counter. She'd changed the routine, and I'd forgotten to drop her off. My phone was on the counter. 9 hours. That car. The baking sun. No air. No water. No power. No help. That heat. A steering wheel too hot to touch. That smell. I opened the car door. Autopilot. Disengaged. Ghost stories? Nah, we don't have anything like that around here. We do have the story of Jacob, but that's about as close as you'll get. You really want to know? Well, I'm not supposed to tell you, but alright, just no interrupting. I don't have the patience for it. How to describe Jacob Emory? Well, I guess you could say he was the kind of guy you could never take notice of. This isn't to say he was a bad kid, in any sense. Many people in this town thought he was the most reliable person for an odd job in the state. But he never really excelled in anything. He was the living proof behind the statement, Jack of all trades, ace of none. Most of this was due to his own lack of will. He dabbled in damn near everything this town could offer him. Automobiles, radios, store management, what have you. But he never stuck with anything. His friends and workers went after him about it a number of times, but everybody got the same unsatisfying response. It just wasn't enough. Needless to say, any friends he kept were either very patient or never spoke of the matter altogether. It was probably inevitable then that Jacob would leave to go abroad. I don't remember where he went, but I think Gertrude down the street knew before she passed on. You'll have to scout someone else if you ever get curious. In any case, no one even tried to stop him. Everybody thought that a little travel would stamp the ambition out of him, or else feed it until it no longer was an issue. Hell, we even gave him a sending off party, which I thought was pretty nice of everybody. So anyway, he was gone for 6 or 7 years? I can't remember. You'll have to check with someone else about that too. Anyway, he came back, eventually, and he had changed, obviously enough. He was amiable, energetic, all smiles all the time, and we all quickly learned why. He showed us a souvenir he'd brought back, a solid black stick, the length of a pencil, but the texture of chalk. We all wondered why on earth such a simple thing would prompt such a spring in his step until he gave his demonstration. He took a piece of paper, and with his stick, God, there's got to be a better word for it. With this stick, he drew a crude circle. It dropped and rested on the border of the paper, like a stone. It didn't leave the paper, but it acted out on it, sort of like an old movie projector on a screen. Look, I know how crazy that sounds, and if you feel like playing skeptic, then you can leave an old man to his craziness. But I know what I saw, even if everyone's been hushing it up. And that stone he drew dropped. Jake even passed around the paper, and as it was being passed, it rolled around as the paper got tilted. None of us had any words for it. Hell, what was there to say? But he continued drawing demonstration after demonstration for us. Stick figures in various pageants and plays doing everything from fighting each other to making perfect human pyramids, and we all thought it was incredible. That was all the go-ahead he needed. He announced that he planned to put on shows to pay for rent and food, where he would draw anything the crowd members wanted. That we talked to some length about, and he eventually convinced us that it would be safe, his drawings ethical, for practice lucrative and unique, and the attention would not go anywhere outside of the town's borders. Poor Jacob. If I'd not been so swept up in the moment, I might have read the signs then and there, and saved the sorry son of a bitch by snapping the terrible thing in half. But I was younger. We all were, and we saw no problem with encouraging him, with what we all saw as an incredible experience to be shared with everyone else. Now, he didn't have any big radio or television connections, mind you, and the internet wouldn't come around for another decade, so he did what all people on a shoestring budget do. He advertised his show with flyers. Flyers might not mean anything to you city folk, but in a small town, they gain a fair glance over from time to time, and what's more, Jacobs managed to stick out by having little figures jump up and down and whatnot to get people's attention. His first show must have gotten nearly 60 or so people, probably a lot more than that. And his shows were fantastic. Someone would shout out a scene from a play or a comedy sketch, and Jake's hand would fly over a white wall like a bird. He'd been holding back when he made that stone, that's for damn sure. His illustrations were all spot on, and he could make an incredible human figure in minutes. Come to think of it, I don't remember any of his scenes lasting more than 10 minutes to make. They were all really well done scenes too. Not only could you see a knight charge a castle, Jake would draw the castle's interior as well, like a wedding cake split down the middle, so you could see the knight scale the walls, fight his way through levels to the dungeon, fight back out with the princess, and make a leaping jump off castle parapets onto his getaway horse, all in complete silence. Not realistic, no, but that was part of the appeal. None of us went in there expecting something real. When a scene or a sketch was finished, either the characters would leave off a wall, or he'd cover the wall with white paint. This was good in a way. It gave these shows a time limit, so that when he'd finished with all of the 4 walls in the room, everyone knew the show was over until the paint dried. Jake, meanwhile, was changing in a bad way. I'd mentioned that upon his return, he'd been extremely energetic. Well, that energy, that vitality or fervour, or whatever you want to call it, never left him. Not for an instant. Far from it. It seemed to grow in him, and he enjoyed it all too much. His eyes grew wider. He slept gradually less over time. His statements and opinions were more radical and frenzied. And though he was never a pushover, he was starting to make people nervous in his company. A month or 2 passed, and Jake's audience grew like a wildfire. Nearly everyone in the town paid to see Jake's art in action, and he had to rent out larger and larger places for them to see it. He now didn't stop after one scene was done. He moved directly onto the next, put on the next blank space on the wall, sometimes to the intriguing effect of causing scenes to mingle, which the crowd loved. The subject matter got more wild and immoral. The monsters got more bizarre and creative. The fighters using more impossible weaponry, all for the sake of the crowd's interests. Jake got steadily more indulgent, which we figured was from the money, and he became a drinker and a womanizer, neither of which got rid of that vitality, by the way. Some of those women claimed that they'd woken up in the middle of the night to see him scribbling with that stick on a drawing pad, a gigantic grin on his face, and while most of them said that they'd assumed he was drawing them in the nude, there's rumours that 1 or 2 of them got glances at that notepad. Those anonymous few supposedly said that those drawings absolutely weren't nude pictures, but neither of them, whoever they are, will say what he was drawing. Don't bother looking for the notepads or flyers though, they're all gone now. I'm getting off track. The point is, he was hitting the bottle, and that's important, because it was that drinking that would eventually ruin everything. On the night of one of his performances, as he walked in front of his cheering crowd, it was completely apparent to everybody that he was completely drunk. I was in the front row, and I could smell the bourbon on him from 10 feet away. The show started. He went through a bunch of sketches and scenarios the crowd recommended, when at the end someone asked that he draw himself. Everyone cheered the idea. I guessed that he'd been wondering what his creations thought of him, and he eventually obliged. No sooner had Jake finished connecting the final 2 lines on his coat than every single character across the vast, expansive wall all stopped and looked directly at that illustration. Lovers stopped kissing, clowns stopped laughing, robots stopped fighting pirates, everything stopped and looked at the Jacob illustration. The crowd died almost instantly. I remember Jake's face at that moment, pale white, full of terrible comprehension at his mistake, and looking desperately for the cans of white paint he'd forgotten to put out before the show. Everyone else, they were looking at the fake Jacob. That Jacob reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a black stick of his own, and as we all watched, drew a door. He pushed on his side, and the door swung open, allowing him to walk through into the floor of the auditorium. The rest was an absolute hellish pandemonium. People screamed and ran for the exits, as Jacob's characters, both of those currently on the wall and those which had previously left it before being covered up, ran out of their own exit, throwing pies and shooting lasers, blowing fire and poison at the impossible. I was near enough to escape, and gave only one backwards glance. The scene will haunt me forever. Jacob Emory was being dragged by his creations, kicking and screaming through the door his copy had made. The auditorium burned down, obviously enough, but I have no idea how many characters escaped, and what happened to the fake Emory, or how many people died. The fire brought the fire department from the nearest cities up to over 100 miles away. They in turn brought the police force, which brought the government, which hushed up everything. They took the flyers and any art Jake had made, and swore everyone to secrecy or else life detainment. The fire was blamed on a cigarette in the garbage during a basketball game, and we all eventually went on with our lives. Jacob was made to never have existed. In retrospect, I realise everything. Jacob hadn't been creating illustrations. Illustrations don't move, much less act or attack. They're just images people see, shadows made to look like real things. Jacob had been making life, actual thinking things in some alternative dimension, using a power that was never meant to fall into mortal hands. He got drunk on his power. His punishment was probably well deserved. Incidentally, the government screwed up on 2 different accounts. They did a damn good job silencing everyone, but proof remains. The ruins are still there, you know. The auditorium's ruins. I hear they're going to start reconstruction soon, which will wipe out any remaining evidence someone can definitely see. But I went back there once, several years after the fire, just once. Amidst the rubble, covered in ash, I saw something squirming. I looked closer. It was Jacob Emory's hand on the wall, exactly like it had been 3 years ago. Sweaty but calloused, I remember. But it was constantly flailing, as if the body it was supposed to be attached to was still writhing in flames. That was mistake number 1. Number 2 was those creations. Like I said, I don't know how many escaped, nor how many the government agents found and caught. But I will say only this. Those tall grass meadows on the outskirts of town, don't go into them, ever. You were asking about those white figures you've seen at night, right? Well, like I said, this town doesn't have ghost stories. This happened to me last night, and now I literally cannot sleep or stop shitting my pants due to its proximity to my house. I'll try to write as much as I can, but first, some background. I'm 21 years old and a college senior. I live in a semi-rural area, about 20 minutes to the closest supermarket or fast food place. I go to school in Washington, D.C., but not the nice part. The part where crackheads are a real thing, and cops are reassuring rather than troublesome. I've definitely seen some shit in my day. It would be good to mention here that I'm not some glandular freak, but I'm about 6'1" and 240-ish. A lot of muscle, but Lord knows I could drop 15 pounds. I like to smoke pot and get drunk and eat. Sue me. Being the good student that I am, I picked a real major, accounting, and I interned for a mid-sized PR firm, doing accounting bitch work and getting paid $20 an hour. College is expensive as fuck, though, so I deliver pizzas at night after the office closes. It's a cheap, drunk food kind of pizza place that has an absurdly large delivery radius and is around 20 minutes from my house and 5 minutes from the beach. My place is north of there, and we deliver probably another 15 minutes past my house. I'm actually typing this at work, in between examining the fine print on our client contracts to ensure we are charging them every penny we can. Cheap bastards. So basically, the further north you go from the pizza place, the more rural it gets. I work until close, and this occurs around 9:45 PM. So, last night, I was in the back of a pizza joint, folding pizza boxes like a good little corporate bitch. The counter girl came back with a delivery slip. She told me the customer sounded weird on the phone, kind of like he was talking through a fan or through his hands, and that he was almost gurgling. My DC experience instantly made me think crackhead, although around here it's way more likely to be some benzo freak or painkiller addict. I automatically assumed some weird interaction would occur. I look at the address. I see it's in kind of bumblefuck nowhere. I'm a little mad, cause I don't want to drive that far, but fuck it. It's the weirdest ticket I've ever seen. The guy has ordered a large pizza with anchovies, grounded beef, ham, sausage, pepperoni, etc. Literally $15 worth of extras. I go ask the counter girl if it's right. She says she thinks so. She couldn't really make it out though, so she said she did her best. She's like 16, so I cut her some slack. Assumed she was daydreaming, and I called the number back. The phone rang 5, 10, 20, 30 times, but there was no answer. I hung up, and I called again. The phone goes right to, "The number you have dialed does not have a voicemail box that has been set up yet. Goodbye." Okay then. The manager decided to just make the pizza as ordered and proceed from there. Whilst the pizza is being made, I delivered another pizza to a hilariously obese and blackout drunk couple. They invited me in for drinks, but I don't drink or smoke when I work. I hoped someone else took the weird pizza, but surprise, no one did. It's my turn. I begrudgingly take the pizza and get in my car. I entered the address into my phone. It's on a side street, adjacent to a park locals call Open Space, which despite the name, is about 500 acres of straight woods. It's about 25 minutes away, basically the edge of our range. On the way there, I crank up my dubstep and crank up my turbo sub and drive. If you're not from a rural area, this can be pretty hard to explain. But winter in the woods is pretty scary. There is never a single sound, ever. Unless there's something larger than a cat walking around, it's you and dead silence. I finally made it to the address. There are a few houses on the street, but they sit on probably 5 acres, so they are spaced out a fair amount. I'm looking for number 1134. I pass 11:30, then a long stretch of nothing, then 11:44. I just want to get this over with and get the next delivery without getting stabbed by some pillhead over a fucking pizza, so I call the number. It rings and rings, and then just stops. There's no sound, but instead kind of like a buzzing or a humming. It's hooked up to my car stereo, and it's getting louder and louder until I just hang up, because I don't want to ruin my speakers. The windows are fogging up, because at this point I'm pulled over between those two houses. Right when I roll the windows down, I am overcome by the odour of decaying trash, like driving through Newark, New Jersey. Fucking gross. So I put the car in first and start pulling toward the next house. At the end of the driveway, there's a stanchion with a light on top. Gonna pull into this house and knock, and ask if maybe they gave the wrong number over the phone. It makes sense for a pillhead. I'm probably 100 feet away when I see someone step out of the darkness into the light at the bottom of the driveway. Good, I think. It's a fucker that ordered. Expecting this guy to be all over the place, leaning over and being fucked up, I notice that the guy isn't actually that fucked up. I stop the car about 10 feet from him. He's wearing a black coat that looks 3 times too big for him, even though he's probably got 5 inches on me. I don't really look at him at first. I'm busy getting the pizza out of the car and getting a ticket and change as I talk. "Hey sir," I say. "Sorry about the wait and the call. This is pretty far." No response. I realise I should be watching him, considering the signs. The smell is still pretty pungent, but I know it's not trash day. I get the pizza on the roof of my car. He is standing under the light on the opposite side of my car. So I got out of my driver's seat and went to the rear to get the pizza. I put the pizza on the roof of the driver rear side. Guy is probably 10 feet away from passenger rear side. I finally pay enough attention to get a good look at him. He's gigantically tall. No shoes, ripped up jeans, stains everywhere. He's wearing a stupidly big jacket, as I mentioned before. And then I look at his face. He has sunken eyes. I can't even see them with the light. I'm getting really sketched out, because the guy hasn't moved or said a word. I stop the process of getting the pizza out, and I just stare at the guy. He is staring right back at me, with those freaky fucking eyes I can't see. His head is sort of bobbing side to side, but not in any fluid sense at all. Kind of like a car door, like how it stops at halfway open, then you give it another shove, and it stops at all the way open. I watch his head do this in no real pattern for probably 10 seconds. I'm starting to get really uneasy, between the stench and the head thing, and the eyes, and the not fucking answering any of my sentences or questions. I stand frozen, and so does he. Without breaking eye contact, I take my phone out of my pocket and hold it level with the roof, so I can look at the guy and my phone at the same time. I go to recent calls. Call the number for the guy. I call it. The phone starts ringing, but I hear no phone anywhere. Then out, in the woods, I hear faintly, so faintly, a cell phone. is ringing, maybe 50 or 100 yards away. This is me kicking myself for not getting my gun out. I am kicking myself for not being armed. I am kicking myself and almost shitting myself. The guy is just standing there, still doing the head thing, but I swear I see him smile. I finally get the courage to speak. Can you please come and get this? Also, I think you may have dropped your phone when you were hiding a body or whatever in the woods. I nervously laugh, still thinking maybe this guy dug too deep into the prescription bottle, or found some PCP or some shit. I see his mouth open, head still bobbing, feet planted to the ground. He makes a sort of low, guttural, quick grunt, then a high grunt, then a low grunt. They are sort of soft, kind of like someone cleaning their throat. I've shut the rear passenger door at this point, and I'm ready to bucket it to the driver's seat if I have to. Just as I go to call that phone again, I hear words. The phone's not mine. The pause between the phone and phone's not was way too long. Phone's not literally sounded like one word. Mine came off an octave higher. My mind is at DEFCON 5, like just full panic attack. My knees are weak. I'm literally about to pass out. I push the pizza to the far side of the roof away from me. Finally say, "Sir, you are freaking me the fuck out. I have a 45 and less than $20 on me. Please come and take this so I can leave." When I say this, the head bobbing stops. His eyes are dark and burning a hole through my skull. He opens his mouth again. It was his... What? I say, stunned. It was his. The phone was his. The guy comes toward the door. Not a step, but like one huge muscle spasm that propels him forward. The phone was his, he repeats. I'm on the verge of tears at this point. I'm standing next to the open driver's side. Pizza is on the roof over the passenger rear door. The guy jerk jumps once closer to the car. The phone is not his anymore. I blubber wordlessly, and then gathering man balls I scream, "I'm gonna call the fucking cops and blow your fucking drug addict head off if you don't get the fuck out of here." I see this fucker smile, this creepy fucking smile, and without moving his mouth, I hear him say in a completely different voice, a voice I've never heard before, "Go away. Stop following me. I will call the police." In one big jerky motion, the thing reaches forward, takes the pizza off the top of the car, and places a couple of round things that I later identify as quarters on the roof surrounded by dark liquid that spreads all over. I don't even think, I just get in the car and peel out down the road. I leave the hot sleeve of the pizza, leave the shit on the roof, don't even close the door all the way. I go down the road at about 80 for a quarter of a mile. Then I pull a U-turn, because I don't want to get even more lost with this psycho around. I whip down the road past the place where he was. Nothing. I finally got to the end of the road. There's a stop sign to merge with the main road. I look right to make sure it's clear. Look left. This thing's face is 12 inches from my own when I turn. I basically shit myself and peel down the road. Later, I finally made it back to the pizza place, shaking like hell. I smoke a joint just to calm me down, which I never do when I'm working. I walk in the front door of the pizza place. "Hey man, that guy at the open space house just called back. He said you forgot some food, but he only ordered the pizza, right? He said come back, I don't know." I start crying. I look at my phone, which has been thrown around the car by my driving. I have 14 missed calls from that number. I'm literally in tears. All the voicemails are empty except the last one. And all I can hear on that last voicemail is ragged breathing and those low grunts. I'm bawling my eyes out now, in front of this hot counter girl, and I don't give a fuck. I sit for 10 minutes and calm down. And then I remember the change on the roof. I go out to the car and I turn on my flashlight. The roof of my car is covered with the most viscous, weird liquid, but it smells like blood and I throw up immediately. In the panel gap between my trunk and the end of my rear window, I find the quarters. They're covered in the same maple syrup goop, blood stuff, and stuck to it are soft little chunks of what I can only imagine is tissue. I go to open my car, and my blood turns to ice. There is a single line of blood going from the front quarter panel to the driver's side door. The fucking thing tried to open my motherfucking door when it was next to me at the stop sign. I cry a little bit more. I go back in and tell the counter girl to try and call the number again. She tries over and over, but the phone goes right to voicemail. The next morning I give the number to my uncle, who is a police captain a few towns over. He says the number is from a burner phone, paid in cash, basically untraceable, and it appeared to be off right now. I sleep with the lights on now. I'd like to start off by saying that I don't have a fucking clue why I'm posting this on X, or really at all. Maybe I'm afraid So, I asked a friend if he knows anyone who had access to some tools I needed to finish a project. He said sure, he knows a guy from work who would be happy to help. Apparently, he was interested in the same kind of art. But he warns me, he's a little bit off. So I drove my friend to work one day, and he introduces me. The guy seems really distant and withdrawn, but he shakes my hand and we chat a little bit. He seems really interested in the woodwork I was doing, and we talked about sculptures and stuff like that for a little while. Things we'd learned, tools we used, etc. The guy warms up a bit, and I ask him if it would be alright if I checked out some of his stuff. He hesitantly agrees, kind of like when you're trying to come up with an excuse, but just can't. He tells me to swing by that night. He says we can chat over a few beers. I say, okay, sure. Later that night I get a call. It's the guy. He sounds a little bit shaken up. Says things are chaotic at home, and right now isn't a good time. He says he'll call me sometime. Whatever, I think. Okay, man. Bye. 2 weeks go by. The guy calls one afternoon. He says things have settled down, and he wants me to bring over some of my work as well, to compare and, blah blah blah. Sure, dude, I say. So I start to head over, and I notice this guy lives in the middle of fucking nowhere. I had to call him up just to find his house. It's at the end of a long driveway, a beautiful acre plus of land. The driveway is littered with trees, and his house is actually pretty nice. As I come up the driveway, something strikes me as odd about the trees I'm passing by. They all have faces carved into them, facing the driveway. Twisted, pained faces. I didn't think much of it. I make morbid stuff myself, and in fact, I was very impressed. The amount of detail was staggering. Looking out into the tree line of the property, every tree had a pained face looking in on the house. Almost like the woods were watching you, wherever you were. This was actually kind of creepy, and I felt pretty creeped out. Looking out was like seeing 100 or so white faces, just crying out. It was kind of like they wanted your attention. I knocked on the door, and the guy answered with a beer in hand, and a much, much friendlier demeanour than before. He helps me carry some of my stuff in, and he shows me around. The guy seems pretty cool. I begin to notice each room has one of those same damned faces hanging above the doorframe. The more I saw them, the more I felt sick. Up close, the faces were more detailed than I had imagined, almost surreal. I asked him what his focus on the faces were for, and the guy kind of tensed up and dodged my question. Upon entering his workshop, which was pretty fucking sweet by the way, he seemed to have other interests besides creepy faces. He had entire 7-foot sculptures of women, men, animals, etc. All very, very well done. And one with a tarp in the back, just chilling there. He says it isn't done yet, so I don't bother. It was right in front of a door that I think led to another room. We begin working on stuff together, trading stories and times we had accidentally injured ourselves. Suddenly, the subject changed. The guy asks me what I think about God. I tell him I'm not very religious, but I don't rule anything out. The guy starts getting a bit loud, saying that God is a blatant lie. He was told so. By who? I ask. He's kind of silent for a moment, then abruptly asked me if I believe in spirits. I gave him kind of the same non-committal answer. It's possible. He starts looking around the room, as if seeing if anyone is around, and then his voice goes soft, and he kind of whispers for a moment. I see things in the woods. At dusk I can see their shadows. Sometimes they whisper from the trees, and I can hear them. Oh dear, I think. Obviously this guy is mentally disturbed. I decide to egg him on. I ask him what they tell him, etc. They tell him that God is a lie. The only thing after death is darkness. He says they laugh at him and leave dead animals at his tree line. I am officially creeped out at this point. He said, for a while, they visited him at night, and each face carving represented a different spirit that had visited him. He says that they can't stand looking at themselves in death, so they don't step within the tree line. That's why he has the entire thing carved out. I've been silent for quite a while at this point. I hadn't had goosebumps so bad since I was a kid, and chills are just running up my spine. He told me that they talk to him from the tree line at night, and they try to get him to leave his home. I eagerly tried to change the subject. The guy looks down and just keeps talking. He's as pale as a sheet, and he was obviously genuinely terrified. He even kind of looks like he's welling up. He tells me I'm the only person he's told. Knowing I'm a stranger, he apologizes. He says he's scared, and he doesn't know what to do anymore. I try my best to awkwardly console this stranger, and the guy actually kind of starts to break down. I think he needs help, but it's not my place to give it to him. I regrettingly ask him why he's afraid. He says the faces don't work anymore, and 2 weeks ago he had something terrible in his living room. I don't know what to say. He walks over to the tarped sculpture and pulls the tarp off to reveal the most mangled, terrible thing I have ever seen. It hardly resembles a human being. It was terrifying to have imagined this guy seeing it standing in his living room. Shortly after that, there's a loud bang on the wall to my right. I nearly jumped out of my skin. This guy doesn't even flinch. Then again, bang! Then it just continued on and on, continuously. Like hail hitting a tin roof. The guy screams, "Stop it! Stop it!" And it ceases. After that, I grabbed my shit, I tell the guy I'm sorry, and I got out of there as quickly as possible. As I'm leaving his home and driveway, I look into the rear-view mirror. The tree line is darker than I've ever seen. The guy calls a week later, and he apologizes. He says he was silly, and everything is okay now. My friend says the guy quit, and no one ever heard from him again.
My grandfather was an inventor. All his life he's been tinkering with something, either taking something that existed and changing it, making it into something brand new, or at the very least different, or inventing something entirely from spare parts. And while nothing he invented was ever earth-shaking, it was always one of my greatest delights, ever since I was a little girl, to see what he'd made. Childhood visits to his home would always begin or end with me sitting on the couch, a look of absolute fascination on my tiny face as he showed off whatever gadget he'd put together in his workshop this time around. It was like having my own personal Santa, who worked all year round to fill my 8-year-old mind with wonder and glee. My older sister was likewise excited. No matter how much she tried to hide the excitement it filled her with, probably in an effort to appear cooler or more mature than myself. And while, because of real life getting in the way, the visits became fewer and fewer the older we got, we would always make time to see him at least a few times a year. And every time, he would have something new to show us. He really was a genius. I should add that it isn't meant to imply something horrible happened to him. I'm sure some days he wishes it had, that it had been him who had wound up in that hospital instead of my sister. But no, he went in his sleep, and I hope that his passing was a peaceful one. Even all these years later, I can't bring myself to be angry about what happened. Can't bring myself to hate him. He had no idea what would happen. No clue how things would pan out. He knew something was wrong, oh yes. He wasn't some doddering old fool. He knew the first time he looked through them that something was wrong, but he thought it was something only a little odd, something unsettling and curious, perhaps, but not anything dangerous. Not anything that would harm anyone. I think, deep down, he just wanted to know that he wasn't crazy. He wanted to be sure that he wasn't seeing things, and who can blame him? There were 3 of us that year. Myself and my girlfriend Justine, and my sister Joan. We were both used to our grandfather being bursting with energy to show us whatever he'd put together, so his oddly subdued mood when he came to the door to greet us came as a bit of a surprise. I was a little disappointed, in fact, as I'd been hoping Justine would get to share in the experience of having a new invention demonstrated before our awestruck eyes. We'd only started dating that year, so it would be the first chance she got to see the kind of things I'd been telling her about. The day passed pleasantly enough, as we chatted, enjoyed lunch, and watched the television together. I think it was Joan who asked him, finally, if he had anything special to show us today. We knew that he'd been working on something, as while this was the first time we'd seen him in person in a while, we'd both spoken to him on the phone in the preceding months, and he'd eagerly explained to us that he was working on something he thought would be quite extraordinary. I still couldn't tell you how he made them, nor could I tell you what his original idea for those oddly coloured circles of glass had been. Before that fateful day, he'd looked through them and seen what he'd seen. He never shared details of his work with us beforehand, as he wanted it to be a surprise, and afterwards, I think he was terrified of the thought of anyone replicating what he'd done. All I know
is that when Joan pressed him to reveal his latest invention, he looked nervous in a way I'd never seen him before. He looked as if he was deeply troubled by something. He hesitated before speaking, as if not sure he should say anything at all, before explaining to us that the nature of what he was working on had changed after an unusual event, and he wasn't sure if it would be a good idea to show us the end result. Now, we may have grown since the days when we could perch on his knee, but whether someone is 2 years old or in their 20s, the surest way to make them want something all the more is to tell them they can't have it. So his reluctance, which at the time I'm sure we both thought was feigned, to heighten the suspense before the unveiling, just made us both want to see his invention more than ever. With a little persuading, he agreed, and left to fetch it. He came back a few moments later, with what appeared to be a pair of glasses, with one big difference. The lenses were like no glass we'd ever seen before. I can't even describe the colour of it without resorting to words like reddish or greeny, as they didn't seem to be exactly any colour that we have a name for. In fact, they didn't seem to be exactly any one colour at all, as if you tilted them one way, they would look different to if you tilted them another. I know full well that probably sounds more like magic than something a well-meaning old man could put together in his humble little workshop, but there you have it. Joan asked what they did, and our grandfather paused for a few moments, as if not quite certain how to answer. In the end, he told us that we really had to put them on for ourselves, as he was certain neither of us would believe him if he told us. Joan wanted to put them on first, but as she lifted them off the table, he reached out and grabbed her hand. He cautioned her that it might be startling at first, but that she wasn't in any danger, and that if she got frightened, she could just take them off. He warned her that what she was about to see may not make any more sense to her than it did to him, but that we were all there and that she was safe. I could tell Joan was a little frightened. She always was lousy at hiding how she felt from people, and even I was feeling a bit unsettled by our grandfather being so uncharacteristically ominous about the whole thing. Joan slipped the glasses on, and we waited. She gasped, and then for the next few moments, she looked puzzled more than anything. Her lips moved wordlessly, and I thought I caught a "No, that's not right" under her breath, as she seemed to look around at something none of us could see. And then she began screaming. I don't know if you've ever heard someone scream in horror in real life. I can promise you this: it is not like in the movies. The movies do not convey the awful sound of someone you love screaming their lungs out, making a noise more like an animal than a human being. They cannot make you feel the things I felt in that moment, watching Joan yank the glasses from her head and hurl them across the room. Nothing could have prepared us for the sight of Joan beginning to claw at her own eyes, screaming louder than anyone should be able to scream as she did it. It took all three of us to restrain her at first. When we had her pinned down so she couldn't hurt herself anymore, Justine and my grandfather held her that way, while I called for an ambulance. I had to watch as she was strapped down and wheeled into the back of one, thrashing and hissing and shrieking, like some mad animal, like something utterly consumed by fear. I explained what had happened, knowing full well how it made me sound. Justine and I both explained the series of events that led to this, to the skeptical, if not totally disbelieving hospital staff, and then to the specialists called in when nothing short of being tranquilized proved effective at stopping my sister from trying to hurt herself while screaming. The glasses had supposedly gone missing, which made proving what had happened very difficult. And it wasn't until almost a year later, long after my sister had been committed, that my grandfather finally confessed to me that he'd destroyed them. I don't know if having them could have helped, could have given the doctors some way to make things right. I doubt it somehow, and I can't truly blame him for doing what he did, given that it was an act born out of guilt and an honest desire to make sure this didn't happen again. I asked him what my sister had seen that day, when he told me what he'd done. I asked what those glasses had done to her. He hadn't wanted to talk about it, and for the first time in my life, I'd raised my voice to him, angrily demanding to know, after all this time, just what had driven my sister to this state. What had affected her so deeply, so profoundly, that she was now no longer even recognizable as a person I'd grown up with. He took me to his workshop and began digging around through the bits and pieces that littered the place. The half-finished and now long discarded inventions still awaiting completion. He produced 2 pieces of glass, rather like the ones that had been fitted into those glasses. He told me that there wasn't any way to describe it without sounding insane, that if I had to know, then I had to see. But he begged me not to do this, that knowing wouldn't make things any better. And he was right. I held the glass up to my eyes, and in an instant, everything changed. Instead of just my grandfather stood before me, now there were dozens more in the room with us. But they weren't people. They were pale and emaciated, hunched over and dressed in dark clothing, with black lips and wide, lidless eyes that seemed to almost bulge from their skulls in a manner both comical and horrifying all at once. Their mouths were full of hundreds of thin teeth, like needles. Their fingers were grotesquely long and ended in dark and viciously pointed nails that scraped along the floor as they walked. And all of them were talking, or rather, their lips were moving soundlessly. Each and every one of them was trying to say something that couldn't be heard. Dozens upon dozens of voices trying to convey something. I dropped the glasses to the ground in shock, and my grandfather brought his foot down on them hard, grinding them to powder beneath his foot, muttering that he should have done this in the first place. He put an arm on my shoulder, asking if I was all right. I was far from all right, and he had been correct. What I had seen had made things worse, not better. It took me a while to work it out, of course, why this had had such a horrifying effect on my sister, and yet I had survived the experience, frightened, but not sporting the mental scars that it had given her. The glasses can only see the creatures. I couldn't hear what they were trying to say to me, couldn't understand the message they were trying to impart. But my sister was deaf. and she could read their lips